I think budgets are kind of strange creatures, and I think this is the 11th or the 12th for me now. And listening to the Minister of the Day, as we did yesterday, you know, there was a X billion going here, Y billion going there, a few million here, a few million there. We could be forgiven for thinking that everything is positive and that life is going to be better and all the problems and challenges in society will be resolved. And with the finance that is available to all the departments, we should have state-of-the-art for all services. And we shouldn't have the numbers that we have on the housing list. We shouldn't have the numbers who are waiting on health services. We shouldn't have the numbers living in consistent and continuous poverty. Basically, we shouldn't have the inequalities that we do have in society. Now, obviously, this is a budget dominated with Brexit, allowing for an event that still, after 3 years, we don't have clarity or certainty. And I do acknowledge that there are challenges in drafting a budget in that climate, and particularly brought home today because I was in the Avery room earlier with representatives from border communities, and their fears of either no deal or a hard deal. One of the things they said was that the dairy industry there would be totally wiped out, similar implications for fishermen, and of course they would be losing the EU funding, which has been so beneficial for them, and it's doubtful that the UK government are going to pick up that, not to mention the ease of movement across the border, particularly in education. So yes, a budget with Brexit in mind, but being struck by Brexit language, pressing an immediate risk to our economy, targeted new interventions to help vulnerable but viable firms, to respond to the Brexit challenge. But where's the same language and where's the same urgency in addressing the challenges that we have in society and that continue to have in society? The scandal of homelessness, the exorbitant rents, the inappropriate and poor rented accommodation, insecurity for tenants, people paying more in rent than they would in mortgage repayments, but unable to get the deposit to buy. So you could say we have interventions, but the facts and the statistics are there that the so-called housing interventions, they're not working because homelessness is increasing. And we have young people in full-time employment who are facing insurmountable challenges to be homeowners. Now, if you look at the Help to Buy scheme, which was to address this, an analysis of the scheme by the Parliamentary Budget Office, and like others I really want to thank them for their work, it's so insightful. The scheme has benefited households at the upper end of income distribution, with a significant number of claims made by households who already had a 10% deposit saved, all suggesting that the scheme did not fulfil its original aims, but instead it supported a significant number of transactions that would have taken place anyway. And now it's to continue in its current form for 2 more years. The current form is not taking the Budget Office's analysis into account, and it's continuing the ideology that a profit-driven market is going to deliver all on the housing needs. Now, HAP has worked for some, but there is discrimination and there is insecurity for HAP households, and they now have the difficulty of where they're living being taken over by the so-called vulture funds, totally at their mercy, because these funds can get higher rents than from the HAP rents. And if we look at what's being spent on emergency accommodation, hotels, B&Bs, there are people who are making a lot of money out of the housing crisis, and the reality is we're seeing people being worse off. I did attend, like Deputy Collins, Social Justice Ireland's budget analysis this morning, and again thanks to them for their work, and they pointed to a reality that we all know, that it's the vulnerable in society who get left behind unless welfare increases keep pace with increases elsewhere in the economy. Now, their statistic was on the need for a €9 weekly increase in the minimum social welfare payments so that social welfare rates would keep up with wage growth. So if social welfare rates are allowed to fall behind earnings over time, increases in poverty are inevitable. Brexit is going to hit them further because they have the least capacity to absorb an increase in the cost of living. So what we'll see is an increase in further inequality. I always look particularly to see how people with disability are treated in the budget, because they are the most vulnerable. Survey after survey, like the survey on income and living conditions, 35% of this group at risk of poverty, which is double the risk for people without a disability. 1 in 3 live on an income that's below the poverty line. And there was a very interesting pre-budget submission from the Oireachtas Disability Group. I'm a member of that, but it's Senator John Dolan and Deputy O'Caolan who really drive that. And what they were looking there, they're disappointed of this sector. They're feeling that the 643,000 members of the disability community have been sidelined in the budget. And in Senator John Dolan's words, there's been a failure to once again specifically address the issues confronting many people with a disability, and it's most disappointing, particularly in the wake of the ratification of the Convention on Rights of People with a Disability. There should have been more benefits in light of the considerable extra challenges that they face in their lives. Senator Dolan did welcome initiatives in the budget, but they're outstripping the level of needs that are growing every year. Turning to climate change, I agree with the increase in carbon tax, but I had to vote against it last night for a couple of reasons. One, we don't know where the 500 million collected to date has actually been spent, and also the fuel poverty review should have been the driver in determining carbon tax. And again, where is the increase for the polluters, for example, the aviation industry? We know the detrimental effects on emissions. We know the need to transition to a low-carbon economy. So, when we talk about equality-proofing budgets, we also need to climate change-proof them as well. Electric vehicle infrastructure, it's all very well putting more into that, but unless people can afford to buy these cars, there's not much point having the infrastructure. The idea of this Just Transition Fund, Just Transition Commissioner, are good in themselves, provided they don't descend into a quango that ends up costing money instead of resolving the issues. Some other points: we have the annual predictable increase on cigarettes. The ultimate goal is to be smoke-free. We know the cost to the health service from smoke-related illnesses, but is this the right way to go? And I do know this, representing Dublin Central, the work that Retailers Against Smugglers do, because what we're going to see are further increases in illegal cigarettes. Now, corporate tax, there is an issue of fairness here. Firms and companies making a profit should contribute to society. Unfortunately, some of them do all they can to avoid this, and they employ people to find the loopholes and the ways to circumvent. A report from the Controller and Auditor General found that among the top 100 corporate taxpayers, who account for 70% of the tax, 8 had 0% rate, 5 paid between 0 and 1%, 1 paid between 1 and 5%, and 7 between 5 and 10%. So there is a number of very large firms who are not playing fair, and they're not paying their fair share. So transparency, more transparency is needed in this area. Taxation measures generally have been supporting business and the better off, and doing very little to help the less well off. The 2 years ECCE for all children is very helpful, but if we look at 0.2% GDP in Ireland, the lowest of any EU country, Sweden 1.9% GDP. Now, there is a distinction arising because there are some creches who won't accept the ECCE because they can get more money from parents who can afford it. So what we're seeing now is we're seeing fee-paying creches adding to the fee-paying second-level schools, primary and second-level schools that we had. I do acknowledge the positives: the R&D credit for micro and small companies, the increase in the numbers of SNAs, additional teaching posts, especially the educational teaching posts, the microbrewery relief, the additional home care hours, 1 million, but the detail is needed on exactly how many home care hours are needed to keep people at home and not in nursing homes or hospitals. Looking at the increases mentioned for the Minister for Culture, increased support for artists and culture. It's very interesting presentation in the AV room from Words Ireland, and they were looking for very modest increases in order to encourage more translation of Irish works, school libraries, writers in school. Very small amounts. I wonder will they get that. But I do know from Angela Dorgan, the chair of the National Campaign for the Arts, she said this budget is sending a message to artists that Ireland doesn't value them. The 5 million increase, 3.75 is already has been already reallocated, so it's really a 1.25. Equally, there is the question of the increased investment for Údarás na Gaeltachta. What about the modest increases that Conor na Gaeilge were also looking for? And having been part of the ministerial team on Moore Street, I do hope we'll see action on that. We have an increase of some 21 million from Ireland's overseas development assistance, a modest increase, but it is an increase. We're now, I think, on 0.4%. It's still a long way to go till we reach 0.7%. The highest I think we got was 0.5% in 2008. So we do need to see a plan on how to reach that over the coming years. And while we're doubling our annual contribution to the Green Climate Fund, we need to look and reduce buying carbon credits to offset carbon emissions. On health, it's the community-based response that are really needed. I know that from my own work, especially supports around addiction, with recovery-oriented programmes, awareness programmes in schools and the youth services, and the local community policing forum to assist the communities to live safely. And I do support the call for core funding for the drugs and alcohol task forces. There has been a recent improvement where we now have beds for people who are addicted to tablets. Mental health, one area that has been neglected, is the area of dual diagnosis. The Department of Children and Youth Affairs, again an increase there, but the youth services and the youth projects are still suffering the effects of the cuts from previous years, and they're also having difficulty now paying the pay increases that they also have to offer. On the capital acquisitions tax, the increase from 320,000 to 335,000 on transfers between parents and children. There is a gross discrimination, and I did give Minister Donohoe a study that I had done on this, for those in society who did not marry and who don't have children. You know, we talk about equality, but this is a serious inequality for single, childless people who want to leave money or property to other family members and friends. And we had the situation of an elderly man marrying his long-time carer so that the carer could inherit without having to pay considerable taxes. Overall, it's difficult to see in the budget that the second strand mentioned by the Minister to improve our public services and help our most vulnerable citizens is being met. The budget is cushioning large enterprises while exposing vulnerable groups to bear the most brunt of a difficult Brexit, whether it's hard or soft. It's going to eat into small business and corporate and into them. The inflation rates are going to increase, and it's the vulnerable who will suffer the most. Business and corporations obviously are coming before people. Next Thursday, October the 17th, I'll be down at the famine statues with All Together in Dignity. And there will be groups there from disability area, from homelessness, people in recovery, people in addiction, former prisoners, unemployed. And I just wonder, you know, how happy they're going to be with this budget, because their motto, like the Irish Aid one, is leave no one behind. But there are people who are being left behind, and even further behind because of what's not being done in the budget. And then just to conclude, I think we have to get away from this idea that budgets have to give something to everybody, because everybody doesn't need something out of a budget. There are people in Irish society who are quite comfortable, quite well off. They don't need anything in a budget, but there are people who need an awful lot more than what they have been getting. I think we need to see budgets for longer. I think we need to see where they're going after that initial year of the budget. And of course, if there is an extension for Brexit, if there's a soft Brexit, are there going to be readjustments made? And it would be good to come back in 6 months and to see exactly what effects this budget is having.